Hi there, welcome into the lesson number 8. By the way, this is the last lesson of this course where we will be discussing typical middle game pawn structures. At the same time, this last topic is very essential as it's a very common middle game scenario and you definitely need to be aware of this. In the previous lesson, along with other things, we were analyzing pawn minorities, and this time we will talk about pawn majorities. We will talk about the typical plans of playing with and against pawn majority. This is the game between Carlsen and Hammer, two strong grandmasters. It is white to move currently, and please think about the position for a while and come up with your solution. How would you play here if you're playing white? There are a number of moves that look decent, like white may move his rook to an open file or advance his queen somewhere to c2 or maybe to c3, threatening checkmate. Though the moves like that are normal, however, the drawback of those moves is that they don't pursue any specific long-term plan, and that's why they're not the most powerful. Currently you can see that an opening stage has just finished, and therefore it is time to come up with a middle game plan. In this situation, you may notice that white has a pawn majority on the queen side. White has 3 pawns on the queen side against black 2 pawns, which certainly gives white an advantage there, and it means that white needs to play on that part of the board. Also, you may notice that one of those pawns of this pawn majority does not have a counterpart, and this is the white c pawn. So there is no black pawn on this line. This makes these type of positions very similar with the topic of passed pawns, which we were discussing in one of the previous lessons, because this pawn, which doesn't have a counterpart, has great prospects to become a passed pawn if you advance it. Therefore, many of the rules and plans for the positions with pawn majority and positions with a passed pawn are the same. When you have the passed pawn, you need to advance it forward. This will create a passed pawn which will hopefully be promoted into a queen one day, or at least this will give you greater space for your pieces, and this pawn will take away some of the squares from your opponent, so he will be unable to use them anymore. And that's why, while advancing your pawn majority, you need to start from the pawn which doesn't have a counterpart. And this is exactly what Carlsen did. He just played c5. Black took the pawn, and here there is an interesting moment. At first, it may seem like the most logical move for white is to recapture with the b pawn and to create that passed pawn right away. However, I hope that you still remember that we discussed that your passed pawns and your advanced pawns may become either a strength or a weakness of your position. It depends on how well it is supported by your pieces. And in the current position, this c5 pawn is somewhat far away from the rest of the white's pieces. Therefore, it does not have enough support, and it's already very strongly blockaded by black's pieces in front of it. Therefore, in this position, it will not become a big power of the white's position. And that's why, instead of capturing with the pawn, which could seem more logical, white took it with the queen. So it's not that white just cancels this plan of creating a passed pawn on the queen side. White still has 2 pawns against 1 on the queen side, and therefore he still plans to create a passed pawn there. It is just that he postpones it for a few more moves, and during this time he'll be able to activate his pieces and make sure that he can provide enough support for his passed pawns. So let's see what happened next. And then after the exchange of queens, now we can see that white's position is more solid than it was before, it's more active, and white just started his main plan of pushing his pawn majority forward, and as you can see once again he starts this push from the pawn which doesn't have a counterpart currently. Like played knight a5, replied with rook d1, and then after the following moves, you can see that black's position is already quite hopeless. White is going to play bishop c3 to remove that knight which is currently blockading the pawns, And by the way, there are no squares where this knight can go to, and after that white can very easily just keep pushing his pawns, creating a passed pawn there, and keep pressurizing black's position, while this passed pawn can just go on and on. At the same time, this is a one-sided game, because black's pawn majority on the king side is useless for him. The white's single pawn on e3 holds two of the black's pawns on the e-file, and therefore black cannot create a passed pawn by himself. Coming back to the starting position of this example, if you have a pawn majority in the middle game, you need to advance it, starting from the pawn which does not have a counterpart, and you need to make sure that your pieces support this advancement well enough. Here's a position from the game between Caruana playing white and Bashir Legrave playing black. Here we can see that both sides have pawn majorities. White has a pawn majority on the queen side. This is quite an overwhelming advantage. He has 4 pawns against 2. While black has his pawn majority on the king side, where he has 4 pawns against 3. This situation determines the plans of both sides, and they just start pushing forward their pawn majorities, which is definitely the right strategy. So white played c4, black played queen d6 just to blockade it. White pushed a5, and black started to expand on the king side where he has majority. And here there was an interesting point of this game. At first it may seem like black needs to push forward his pawn without a counterpart, and in that case this is the pawn e5 which needs to go forward by playing e4. This is a logical move indeed. However, there is another plan that you may also take advantage of when you have pawn majority. At the beginning of this course, winning the middle game, we were discussing the situations where you have an extra pawn, where you have material advantage. When you have a pawn majority, there is a somewhat similar situation. It's not that you have an extra pawn, it's not like you have material advantage. But nevertheless, you do have an extra pawn on a certain part of the board. Same with the situations with the extra pawn where it's a material advantage. When you have pawn majority, this extra pawn gives you some additional advantages, apart from the fact that it just can go forward and maybe be promoted into a queen one day. In addition to that, it controls some squares that your opponent cannot use anymore. It may give you some space advantage if you move it forward, and therefore it may help you be more active on a certain part of the board. That's why, while using this pawn majority, you can not only push it forward to promote the pawn into a queen, but another typical plan is to push it forward for getting an advantage on a certain part of the board and then starting an attack there. This is what black decided to do in this game, and that's why he played h4, and his plan is to attack on the king side to attack the white's king. So let's see what happened next. White played with g4, which is a creative idea to mix up the things. In case black takes this pawn, white will reply knight c3, and then the knight goes to e4, disturbing black's queen, and also white will be able to make use of his pawn majority in the center, and the situation becomes very unclear. That's why instead of accepting this pawn sacrifice, black just castled to keep the situation as it is. White moved knight c3, and black kept pushing his pawns forward. He played e4, and after queen to e3, black found a way to start the direct attack of white's king. He played bishop d8 with a very straightforward idea of putting the bishop to c7 and then to play queen h2 checkmate. All of a sudden, white is defenseless against this very straightforward idea. In addition to that, still the pawn on g4 is hanging, and black can take it any time, which will also include his f8 rook into the attack, and it's just overwhelming. White cannot hold the position. In the game, he decided to give up a piece for the black c4 pawn, but it didn't help, and he lost pretty soon after that. In this game we have seen another typical plan of playing with the pawn majority. Still, the first step is to advance it. That's what black did while starting to advance his kingside pawns. He played f5 and then h4 and so forth. So this is the first step of the plan. By advancing your pawns, you get an advantage on a certain area of the board. And the second step is that you go for a direct attack. And as always, you can either attack opponent's king or his pawns. And in this game, black did both of these things and win the game easily. Now let's analyze this situation from the other side. How should you play when you fight against pawn majority of your opponent? In the current situation, and by the way this is the game between Carlsen and Grishuk, two of the top grandmasters, white has pawn majority on the queen side, on the right side of the board. He has 4 pawns against 3. As we know, black really needs to care the most about white's pawn on the c-file, where black does not have a counterpart, black doesn't have his own pawn, and therefore the white c-pawn has the greatest potential to go forward and be promoted one day. That's why black decided to take countermeasures, and he decided to blockade this pawn. That's why he played b6. Now it makes very tough for white. The situation is getting very tough for white. He can't play c5 easily at all. He played rook c1, trying to provide some extra support for this pawn, and now black made another prophylaxis move to impose even stronger blockade against white's pawn majority. But before we can come up with a good prophylaxis move, we need to find out what is the white's plan. We already know that he wants to push his pawn to c5, but he can't do that right away, and therefore he will need to support it by advancing his b pawn to b4 first, and only after that he will be unable at some point push his c5 pawn forward. Knowing the white's plan, black can counteract, and he plays a5, preventing white from playing b4 somewhere in the future. And now already the situation is much harder for white than it was before, and there is no obvious way for white to realize his plan, or at least it will take a very long time. White played knight a1, which is a bit of an ugly move, putting the knight in the corner, but there is no other square for the knight, and white still needs to prepare advancement of his b-pawn. Black played g6, and white finally pushed the b4 pawn. Even though white managed to push the pawn forward, you see that anytime black is ready to capture that pawn and hamper white in his plans, which is also somewhat inconvenient for white. And for now, black played knight g7, white made that exchange himself, played bishop d3, and black managed to put the knight on a powerful blockade square c5. And you can see that now the white c4 pawn is totally blockaded. It has absolute no way to go forward, and that's an ideal blockade for black when you have the knight in front of opponent's pawn. Then your knight is very active, and at the same time it is blockading this pawn. Let's come back to the starting position of this example. Here black realized that white will be trying to make use of his extra pawn on the queen side, and black took preventive measures to blockade the white's pawn majority. He played b6 to stop the c-pawn, and then he played a5 to stop white's b-pawn from coming forward. In the following moves he even strengthened his blockade by putting the knight on c5, and the white's pawn majority was neutralized entirely. In the future, black even won this game. Here's the game between Tomaszewski and Dinkleren. It is black to move at the moment. First of all, you may see that white has the pawn majority in the center and on the king side. He has 4 pawns against 3 there. Therefore, you may expect that white wants to push these pawns forward, especially his central pawns. Probably he'll be preparing that f5 advancement, and then maybe the e pawn can go forward as well. In addition to that, right now, tactically, white is threatening to go knight d4, attacking the black's queen and also the pawn on c6. So, what should black do? The most obvious decision is just trying to stop white from playing knight d4, and black can go bishop c5 to take control over that square, which does look very, very logical for black. At the same time, it only counters the tactical threat of knight d4, but it does not counter the white's plan in general. And white is going to just concentrate more pieces in the central direction and prepare advancement of his central pawns. He may start by playing rook d2, and on the next move he'll play another move rook a d1, attacking black's knight on d7 and pushing it away. Then white can go with knight e4, putting one more piece in the center, and this knight can possibly go to d6 or to g5 in the future. And once white gets enough support of his pieces, he will finally start pushing forward his central pawns, his f-pawn and his e-pawn. They will start going forward, and black will have to go back with his pieces, therefore giving white a total domination and an absolutely superior position. Therefore, although bishop c5 can help black short term, in long term, white will be able to develop a devastating attack. Therefore, black needs to come up with something else. So let's go back to the original position. If you see that your opponent has a pawn majority, and you have no obvious way to blockade it, because in this case, if black tries to somehow play g6 at some point, well, I mean, maybe not right now, because it still doesn't counter knight d4, but even at some point, this will even strengthen the white's attack, because this creates new weak squares around black's king, so that's probably not an option for black. Thus, when you see that your opponent has the pawn majority and you have no effective way to blockade it, this means that you need to find your counter plan and pursue it really quickly, because you don't have time to wait. If you just wait and try to hold the position, your opponent will develop his successful attack. That's why black played knight c5. He somewhat ignores white's plans at all, and he's going to put his knight in a strong central square d3. White executed his threat by playing knight d4, then by capturing that pawn on c6, and black calmly played knight d3, ignoring all of the white's threats and this time giving up the exchange. Now you see that black continuously fights for the initiatives, realizes his own plan, and ignores whatever white is doing. For now he's given up the exchange, so white can win some material. However, now black has a lot of counterplay, and that was his main intention. Right now black is ready to play bishop b7, creating some potential threats along the long diagonal. Another bishop is ready to come to c5, putting pressure on a neighbor diagonal and attacking the white's knight. And of course black has his monster knight on d3, which is controlling many squares in the white's camp. I'm not saying that the situation is winning for black, it's not the case at all. The position is very complex, white is up on exchange, black has an active piece play and some compensation. Nevertheless, the main thing that black achieved is that he started his counter plan and now white has to react. White has to forget about his pawn majority and instead just switch to defense and caring about the problems of his position and how to deal with the black's attack. The general conclusion from this example is that if you see that your opponent has a pawn majority and you have no easy way to blockade it, then you need to rush with your counterplay. Find your own plan, and you know what it should be. It should normally be either attack of opponent's king or his pawns, and make haste in realization of this plan, because you have no time to wait, otherwise your opponent will make use of his pawn majority and will demolish your defense. Conclusions. When you play with pawn majority, your plan consists of two steps. Step number 1. Advance your pawn majority, starting from the pawn without a counterpart. This will already ensure your advantage on this part of the board. Then you come to the step number 2. Here you have two options, either create a passed pawn or start attacking opponent's position. When you play against pawn majority, here you have two possible plans. Plan number one is blockade opponent's pawns. Maybe in the future you'll even be able to start attacking them, but originally the goal is just to blockade them. The second possible plan is rush for counterplay. If you see that there is no effective way for you to blockade opponent's pawns, then you've gotta take some risk and start drastic measures to start your own attack and deflect your opponent from his plan. As you can see, in both cases, whether you're playing with pawn majority or against it, you have very clear middle game plans. Hopefully you'll use it successfully in your games, and I'm wishing you all the best in your chess battles.